Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Medtech POV, a podcast brought to you by AdvaMed, the Medtech Association, the world's largest trade organization for medical technology companies. I'm your host, Scott Whitaker, and today we're pleased to have Venk Varadan, co-founder and CEO of Nanoware, a medtech startup developing new technologies to improve diagnostic testing with nanotechnology and AI. We had a great conversation on the future of AI in healthcare and the role FDA and CMS play in ensuring life-saving and life-improving medtech reaches the patients who need it most. The future of nanotechnology in healthcare is fascinating as well, and Nanoware's innovation in this regard to continuously monitor blood pressure holds great promise for other healthcare testing and monitoring in the future. So with that, I hope you enjoyed this episode. All right, Venk, welcome. Good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Scott.
You know, I always like to start these out giving the listener a little bit of an understanding of the person behind the big CEO title. So why don't we start out doing that with you? Tell me a little about your upbringing and where you're from, your parents, and so forth.
Yeah, still small company CEO. So, but grew up in State College, Pennsylvania, Central Pennsylvania. My folks taught at Penn State University for the better part of 30 years. My whole family actually went to Penn State. Older sister and a twin brother were the babies. My parents are both math science, first-gen immigrants from the southern tip of India, Kerala and Tamil Nadu. And I think as a first-gen immigrant kid, all of us that are not indigenous kind of went through this, or our families did at some point. When you come over, there's an element of risk-taking in.
Right.
And I think that kind of came through to a lot of us, particularly me and my siblings. And then obviously the math and science kind of permeated as well. And then me, my brother, and my sister kind of grew up with that attitude. And while my parents kind of put us in everything, we played every single sport competitively, we played every instrument, things like that. But I think the three of us growing up in Central PA kind of learned more than just the mental acumen, confidence, leadership, trying some new things.
Yeah.
And that was all super impactful from a young age. And then actually as an entrepreneurial background, me and my twin brother, the first company I ever started was with him. He went to NYU for film as a filmmaker, and we started a production company, produced several of his films. And a film is actually very much like a medtech startup. There's so many different components. There's regulatory, getting permitting, making sure that you're allowed to shoot at certain times. And there's the camera department, there's the hardware, there's the talent, and you've got to raise capital to shoot it. And so I think not knowing that at the time, I think it's a lot of things that I learned from my family coming up from a kid all the way to a young adult really helped set the stage for a career in medtech.
And then you went on to college and graduate school as well, right? Tell us about your educational journey.
Yeah, I went to Duke University, proud Blue Devil, as you know, studied BME and chemistry, and thought for the longest time I would go to med school. That's what I was interested in. That's what I was good at. And about a week before graduation, I sort of realized in 3 months I was going to go back to school for another 8 years, take out more debt. And I hadn't even really seen the world yet. And so I called up my father and broke his heart and told him, I don't think I want to go to med school anymore. And did a program with the American Red Cross in the Caribbean and Haiti and the Dominican Republic for about 10 months. And did village infrastructure work, baby vaccinations, things like that.
Yeah.
Thought I would be totally motivated to go to med school, and I came back and it did the opposite, kind of pushed me into industry. And the rest sort of history. And then started out in the pharma industry, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but then went to business school, took out more debt, and then kind of found my way on Wall Street and did investment banking, M&A, and then growth equity before starting the company.
Remind me, where'd you get your graduate degree?
Columbia.
Yeah. Okay. So if Duke and Columbia play, where are you?
It's Duke.
Still stay with Duke.
I don't understand necessarily how people can follow their grad schools. And when they do, I just assume it's because their undergrads didn't really have a team.
There's probably a lot of truth to that. Yeah, for sure. So what was your first job when you came out of business school?
Out of business school, I started at UBS in New York. I was a junior associate in investment banking, covering mostly enterprise software and communications technology companies. So I think that was interesting, not only just understanding the financial and bookkeeping aspect as well as the deal-making aspect that you're supporting, but it was giving me now in 2008, a very early look at the technology space. Software was really becoming a staple at that. Back then, we were still doing Polycom calls, and maybe we were getting pretty decent with PowerPoint, if you remember, right? But Web 2.0 was right around the corner.
Yeah.
And maybe just 18 months later, Facebook's valuation was changing every weekend, if you remember.
Right.
So I thought that experience was really good, me being kind of on the forefront, coming out of the Great Recession when a lot of capital moved to the West Coast.
Yeah. What an interesting time to go into the banking industry. 08, 09, even 10, right? I mean, you saw more turmoil, I would think, in those 2 or 3 years, and the experience must have been fascinating.
It was, and it was super stressful.
Yeah.
I got my first EKG when I was in 2008, the end of 2008. When I signed my offer, my group in New York was 33 people. By the time I got to the floor in September of 2008, which was just weeks before Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy, our group was 11 people.
Wow.
And so
did you feel it coming? Did you kind of know at that point, or were you too far
I think
removed?
we were all really scared. I mean, my classmates that were going to Lehman Brothers, they didn't have a job. Right. And then some of the people that we would summer intern with the year before, they were let go. And we were kind of the new people. We were the cheapest. So,
good timing in one respect, right?
Great timing. And the other thing too, if you think about deal teams when times are flush, they're much bigger.
Right.
And then after a reduction in force, the junior associate and the junior analyst, there's a lot more responsibility because there's not as many layers between you and the senior partner.
Right.
So because we came out of the recession pretty good, if all things considered, as scary as it was in 2008, about a year later, due to good government policy and sort of responsible behavior from the large cap corporations, deals started picking up, and it was a great experience for those of us that were fortunate enough to keep our chair. But it was scary. I mean, we were showing up every morning wondering if the chair was still there. Sometimes we didn't leave, just made sure we stayed overnight that the chair was still there.
Had to hold on to that job.
Yeah, exactly.
Your parents must have had an important role during that time. Obviously, growing up in your family, well-educated family, driven people themselves. But going through a bumpy time like that when you first came out of business school, how did your parents help guide you through that period?
I think just their experience, as I sort of said at the top, when you're 26 years old and you've gone to 2 expensive schools and you've taken out, a good amount of debt, and the goal is, okay, I got it. I'm starting my career. I'm starting my suit and tie job every day.
Right.
And then all of a sudden it could be snatched away. Hearing a story from my father or my mom when they were literally writing handwritten letters from India to universities over here, taking a month or 2 to get a response back, right? Think about the anxiety of that.
Oh, yeah.
Different level. That's life-changing, whether that letter comes in. Maybe the letter got lost. Maybe nobody read it.
Right.
There's just so much that they didn't know. So I think just hearing those experiences from a perspective that was not mine always keep me grounded in that regard. Always just remember you're lucky.
Yeah, that's for sure. So, and then after the banking world, where'd you go next?
So left with one of the partners to another firm, Citadel, and then closed my career at Wells Fargo Securities. And I think during that time of doing a lot of venture-backed and growth equity stuff, that entrepreneurial bug, I think always existed, but it kind of sprouted in me at that, because I was working with management teams. I was seeing 10-person companies become 50-person companies, then somebody getting acquired by Google or something like that. And I think before you become an entrepreneur, I'm a first-time founder, as you know, I think you think that there's like this magical quality that you have to have. And especially as first-gen immigrants, we're risk takers, but we're conservative in it, right? Like it's kind of a dichotomy in that you're not going to just go right to the casino, which is what kind of a startup feels like to some extent.
Right.
But I think working with those management teams, I learned a couple things. Yeah, you got to be smart and you've got to be driven. You got to have a good idea and passion. But that last part is the important one. I mean, are you going to never give up? As Jimmy V says, you know what I mean? Just never give up. Keep running through those walls. That was the quality I realized was kind of the consistent theme on who was successful and who wasn't. And so I felt comfortable sort of, these are just normal guys and girls that really believe in something. And so that's when I sort of was deciding, do I follow the path of career and be the corner office finance guy, or do I start something new? I was in my early 30s and it felt like the right time to do it. We started our company with our co-founder's idea, who is my father.
Yeah.
Dr. Venk Varadan, his invention of our core sensor technology, our cloth nanotechnology, was what we started the company around. So after all those years of me not going to med school, he was happy with me again. Going back to healthcare with this idea.
Did the idea originate from him then?
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about that process and how he came up with the idea and then you decided to create a company around it.
Yeah, it's I love telling this story about how the technology came together. When my parents were empty nesters in 2005, they actually left Penn State for almost 7 years and went to the University of Arkansas. The Walton family gave the big 21st century gift at the time. They brought a ton of engineering and technical talent into the university. And my parents, sort of recognizing this might be one of the last parts of their academic career, were really excited about that opportunity, kind of entrepreneurial in that sense, right? And Dr. Varadan, my father, a lot of DOD and DARPA funding for nanotechnology-based sensors were things that he was working on, even at Penn State, but then at University of Arkansas. So if you think about what nanotechnology is, it's billions of these sensors on a really small footprint.
Right.
Billions per centimeter of surface area. So he started his sort of development probably 20 years before we even started the company. So with defense-related applications, if you think about like a submarine, right? At a certain depth, 20 or 30 meters, the sonar is incapable of differentiating between a school of fish, a geyser, or a Russian sub, for example, right? And you can't make the hull of the sonar area bigger. You can't just make it bigger to capture all those nuanced reverberations. But if you start putting nanosensors on the hull, now you've got a much higher surface area on the same footprint that can start to understand those minute sort of differences in sonar reverberations, right? With accuracy, because you've got all those touch points. He did the same thing with high altitude aircrafts. And so his idea was the human body is also a hard to detect environment. Right. And so what if I take this same concept and put sensors outside the body? Now you can't use carbon nanotube technology because carbon is corrosive to the skin. So he who ended up being our founding engineers, his current master's students, they tried so many different iterations with different chemical formulations and different element combinations. And they came up with this cloth nanotechnology. But while we're, I guess, still a young company, 9 years in, this tech has been worked on for decades. And started with government funding, which a lot of us have.
DARPA funding.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating. Speaking of government funding and government activity, you've made a lot of progress, made it through the FDA process now, right? And got a recent approval to go to market, I believe. So tell us about that process and where you are now.
Yeah. So our regulatory strategy was kind of came all the way back in the beginning in late 2014 when we started the company. We had a decision to make. Are we going to be a consumer company or are we going to be a healthcare company?
Right.
And maybe stubbornly so, but we chose healthcare. And it was to take advantage of that really high fidelity of the sensors. It was just a basic sensor. Yeah, maybe we go consumer, get to market quicker. But the cleanliness of it, the clinical grade quality of the signals, and the fact that in 2014, did you really want to jump into the same pool as Apple and others? You know what I mean? In consumers. So I think some of the business considerations led us to healthcare. But when we started, we were like, no one's going to take us seriously unless we get FDA approvals. Start there. Right. So there was a strategy on get the cloth sensors cleared. So we got that cleared in 2016. The first and only cloth still in the world that's been 510(k) cleared for capture and transmission of essential performance biomarkers from skin contact. Then we thought, what if we can take the cloth and start to replace a bunch of first-line diagnostic tools? We'll talk about this, I'm sure, when we talk about digital health as a sort of sub-industry. But we wanted to take something that could be self-administered and replace a bunch of tools at once. So that was our clearance in 2020. We benchmarked against the stethoscope, we benchmarked against the Holter monitor, we benchmarked against the hemodynamic bedside monitor, against the activity monitor, and got substantial equivalency for all of those in one device. But it was still analog. This was all no digital component to this at this point. Then in 2021, we wanted to sort of make all of this be pushing into the cloud time synchronously. So mobile app infrastructure, back-end software as a service infrastructure, front-end delivery to a physician or clinical investigator. That was cleared in 2021. Uniquely in that clearance, which I think is an important point to make, we knew we didn't want to be prescriptive on how the data was delivered, because that was a problem we learned with Gen 1, Gen 2 digital health companies. Hospitals would be like, oh, do I need to use another app? Do I need to use another portal? So we have our own assets, but we wanted to be able to plug in to whatever is being used by a health system or a company or what have you. And that was really, really smart thinking from our product team as we looked at case studies. But that was all a setup, Scott, to the fourth approval that just recently happened. All of those steps were for the purpose of getting data-driven digital diagnostics. That was always my vision. And it took many more years than I thought it would be, 9 years. But we get such incredible data and so many data points of it, 85 biomarkers, as we've talked about, across the heart, lungs, vascular, and hemodynamic system. What can we start to understand by putting those all together in algorithms using AI and machine learning techniques? And the fourth one we got was the first ever AI hypertensive diagnostic and continuous blood pressure tool that can be self-administered at home. And we could have entered the market with our previous clearances, but I thought that until we got this to really separate ourselves and also show the market, this is the first of many software as a medical device algorithms. We've got a whole pipeline now that are no longer theoretical. And I think now, FDA is kind of comfortable with our approach. They understand our data fire hose, and really excited about not only the commercial launch, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but what's in the pipeline.
Yeah, that's exciting. I want to go back to FDA for a minute, because a lot of people who listen to this try to understand what's it like to work with FDA. Other entrepreneurs who are trying to assess, should we push toward a healthcare technology or consumer technology? Talk about your experience. You talked about the importance of having it, but what was the process like for you to get that clearance, all four?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to sort of my experience in learning what an entrepreneur is, right? I think before you interact with FDA, you think that this is some clouded rain cloud, like wizard castle, right? That only certain people know how to navigate, or you have to have a lot of resources to do. And we were a startup, and we were talking to fellow companies. They're like, hire this lawyer, hire this consultant. I'm like, well, we don't have money to do that. And as anything, I think it's relationship building. And I think once you understand you chose to go to healthcare, FDA is a partner here. They're not an adversary. And we understood that very, very early, and just started speaking engineer to engineer. And that's what they are at FDA. They're just they're people. They're people with really, really strong backgrounds in clinical medicine and engineering. And what I think we learned in the first clearance was different time before the pandemic, as you can imagine. Get in front of them early and often. For our first clearance, 2.5 years into when we started the company, we were down in DC 11 times. And yes, you're not going to get the same reviewer each time, but they're documenting everything, right? And they know your approach on that. I think the first three clearances were, I wouldn't say straightforward, because the nanotechnology and the multi-parametric nature were novel, but you were still benching substantial equivalency against something that existed and something that could be tried. When you start to do AI, this was a very different battle. And what I think was great about the process, balance sheet issues aside, right, which again is not FDA's problem. They're there to evaluate safety and efficacy. And they do a phenomenal job in that regard. But as a startup, time is everything. Right. And coming out of the pandemic, pre-sub meetings were delayed. There were so many EUA authorizations for COVID and for others that there was such a backlog for FDA. And what we realized was, maybe we'll just go ahead and submit, because per our MDUFA guidelines, they're going to give us feedback at minimum. We didn't expect we would get approved the first time, but there was strategy involved there. And we kind of let our review team know that, hey, we think we're following all the parameters here, and we think we're following all the patients and the right standards. And we got a non-substantial equivalency in the first year and a half, and had a follow-up call with FDA, which again, some companies just don't do. We reached out right away and asked for senior management and said, hey, just walk us through, what did we do correctly? What more do you need? And I think when you're doing AI and hemodynamics, what in retrospect, after going through 3 submissions, so we got rejected again.
Yep.
A lot of this was us learning with FDA.
Right.
And understanding that there are no standards. There's got to be one guinea pig in a certain space that is helping the agency understand what should be applicable to everyone else, and helping the industry understand what should be happening to everything else. And so that partnership and the rigor they put us through, I have to be honest, Scott, it's made our claims and our approval so much stronger. If we had gotten approved the first time we submitted, we would have had 100 patients worth of data in 3 different geographies.
Okay.
As an example, when you're using AI, the heterogeneity, understanding that you need to have X% Black Americans, X% Hispanic Americans, X% old, X% young, X% BMI, following that middle 90% of the US census. Are you testing in 5,000 feet elevations? Are you testing at sea level? Are you testing in humidity? You may think that these things are overkill, but this is kind of probably how the industry should be regulated. With AI. And so we ultimately had 448 patients, 36 gold standard data points per patient. So you're talking close to 30,000 data points from training and validation, and 19 different geographies, mirrored the US Census and ethnicity and demographics and BMI. And so what we're really excited about is our ability to share that with the peer review community. A lot of these algorithms that are recently coming out, if you're getting, not to pick on an institution like Mayo Clinic or Cleveland Clinic or some of the big academic centers that are really at the forefront of this, if they're using all of their historical data to train their AI, are we sure it's going to work in Mississippi? Are we sure it's going to work globally, like in Honduras or something like that? So, and we're not necessarily sure ours, but we have a good representation of the USA, which is where we are. And I think part of what we did, or at least components of it, if not all, will probably be in some new standard guidelines on what to do in AI and hemodynamics. Obviously, blood pressure is an example of a hemodynamic, but long-winded answer to your question on what it was like to work with FDA, but
do you feel
positive experiences.
Do you feel like now that they've gone through this process with you, that they're better positioned for other AI tools going forward? And I ask it in the context of some people feel like they have a good experience. Some people feel like they don't have necessarily a great experience at FDA on the AI front, right? And the different learning tools that are being used now. What's your sense? Is it still evolving, or do you think they're mature now?
It's going to always evolve, in my opinion. And while we were getting rejected, we were not having a good time. But I also think that you have to, especially as a startup, you have to take what they're giving you as learning. Right. And understanding that they are your partner and they're here to make the product better.
Did they tell you that? Was it clear to you that they were your partner when you were going through the process? Or did you understand that from talking to other people a little more intuitively?
I think it's a great question. I think it was both. I think it was having a glass half full optimism, which any somewhat insane entrepreneur has to have, right? I mean, you can't just be a pessimist and dive into this complicated type of industry that we are all in. But I think how they were interacting with us, offering time, knowing that, hey, our science is there. We just need to prove it. Okay, you don't need to send in a request for another 90 days to jump on the phone with us. Let's jump on the phone. And I thought that interaction, again, just as you're building relationships with people, we started interacting with them more and more and more. They were making suggestions on, hey, this additional information request came out. Before you send it in, why don't you preview it with us? Right? And then there were new things that I think some companies may not be comfortable with, but we certainly were, at the end, because it's AI, maybe this becomes a standard. One of the last questions they asked is, can you open up the server to us? We'd love to review all the raw data. I thought that was a great signal for us. Some might look at it and be like, no, I don't want to do that. I can think of companies that would never open up their data to anybody. But in a partnership aspect, I don't think they felt uncomfortable asking for it. We didn't feel uncomfortable giving it to them.
Because you knew the data was good.
We knew the data was great. So,
exactly.
And look, I think there's something to be said about that. If they're not going to be able to evaluate how the AI in the black box works.
Right.
But if they have the ability on millions of data points to spot check 10 examples or 20 examples, right? Stage 2 patient here, stage 1 patient here, normal patient here. You're building that credibility and confidence in a two-way relationship, and that's what it is.
Yeah.
And that might be a standard for AI going forward. Hey, we'd like to see the raw data, all of it.
Technology is moving so fast. People are innovating so quickly. If the regulators aren't able to keep up with that innovation, it's really going to slow things down, right? So there's some balance that you have to strike through this entire process, right?
I agree. When we say that we got through this from start to finish with the rejections to approval in 3 years, people are like, wow, that was fast.
Yeah.
For startup, that's not fast, right? A lot of us could run out of money. A lot of us could run out of money and the lights get turned off, even with great foundational science. So I do hope that when we say AI, we also have to kind of take a step back and say AI means a lot of things from an application standpoint. Is it workflow? Is it imaging? Is it language models? Is it hemodynamics? I'd say imaging and language models, FDA is getting pretty comfortable with.
Right.
Those are static inputs, right? Whereas a hemodynamic, as we talked about, that's moving all over the place every millisecond.
Right.
And so will there be new standards that hopefully companies like us can sort of put down in cardiovascular hemodynamics? Hopefully.
Right.
And I think that's their goal too. There's a conference at Johns Hopkins next week, AI in regulated devices, where we invited half of our review team to come, because I think they want to learn too. Right. And hear from the industry experts. So I agree that the industry will probably always pull the government regulators because, especially the startup community, speed is our only option. Right. But I am encouraged and confident that the wheels are getting greased and they're learning more. They're hiring the right people. Even just bringing someone like Troy from Oracle on to head up digital health. These are all really, really good hires and forward thinking from CDRH and FDA.
Yeah, there's a culture issue that really matters too. And I think it starts from the top. I was talking to one of your board colleagues about this recently. And the culture is different now than it was, say, 10 years ago. Right? And the leadership's different than it was 10 years ago or so. And the focus is on trying to help you get there, because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do is get a product to market, but for patients who are suffering, right? And as long as they understand that and connected with us to get there, it probably stays on this path. If it reverts back, it's a problem, right? For all of us.
Yeah, and I've heard the stories. I was not in the industry in the yesteryear of the FDA's culture. And obviously all the work that you and our fellow CEOs were pioneering with that, again, long-term relationship building, new culture, new people in there. I think we're in a really good place with FDA. And I think that the leadership sort of knows that at the end of the day, we're all here, industry and FDA, for the patients that we serve. And tech is going to increase and better those outcomes. And also, well, I'm sure we'll talk about payment, but reduce costs at some point too.
And that's exactly where I was going next. Because if the sort of culture and the leadership style and the government payment systems were to match the culture of FDA, I think we'd be in a better place there as well, right? It's one thing for you to get an approval from FDA, but if you don't get somebody to pay for it and cover it over the course of the next 5 or 10 years, it creates a different problem, which is very serious as well. So talk about that next phase for you, Venk, and then broader for the industry, the importance of that payment phase.
You think you knock one stone down and, a whole nother hurdle in market adoption. Yes, we can sell now, but if there isn't appropriate reimbursement for the physicians and the health systems that are using it, as well as the ability to kind of have margins that can keep your lights on as a company, the innovation is going to stall. And this has been an issue for medtech and digital health and in CDRH regulated companies for many, many years. For us, as many different ways as we've tried to approach the health system and cardiology clinic model, we haven't found a way that averts the valley of death which is, for those listening, is that sort of 2 to 4 year period where you kind of have to give your product away for free.
Right.
And collect evidence to show the outcomes to Center for Medicare and Medicaid and or private payer or value-based care organizations to say, these are the outcomes we're providing. This is the amount of reimbursement we should get. One of the companies we had mentioned, the arrhythmia companies and atrial fibrillation companies, iRhythm was a kind of a trailblazer, but a great case study of this. Amazing patch technology, really replacing those wired up, sticky Holter monitors. Got FDA clearance and for 3 years were kind of just flat, maybe taking some down rounds and collecting that real world evidence. And then they had enough. They got the Novitas code, and all of a sudden they've become the market leader, and they have been since.
Right.
Did we want to follow that model? In this market, it's tough to raise capital to give your product away for free.
Yeah.
And so we kind of fell into a different model, kind of by trial by error. We're selling into medtech and pharma and biotech companies and the CROs that serve them because we have a self-administered, basically full cardiopulmonary assessment tool at home. We can be a safety and efficacy primary endpoint based on the validation we had with FDA to evaluate somebody else's implantable device, their therapeutic, as they need to understand their path through FDA and their path in real world evidence for their own payment reimbursement. So while we are getting paid by these companies because they pay for their clinical studies and to do the self-checkups between control and placebo group, a lot of these clinical trial participants, they have to go into a system once a month for 4 years during that clinical study.
Right.
You can imagine some are living 50 miles away in rural communities. They'll drop out at some point.
Right.
That's entire cost of a patient that Eli Lilly or Medtronic is losing on that just based on logistics.
Right.
And hurdles of maintaining a patient through 4 years. But if we can keep them at home, and have them self-administer, we're dropping that cost burden and that logistical dropout burden big time. But here's the key on that. Because we're continuous at home, we're probably giving them indirect value on how much better and more real-world data than you're getting in a 30-second reading of checking if this hypertensive medication worked or not with a point solution 30-second reading. So there's a lot of value from that recent approval that sponsors and big companies have kind of reached out to us because they're looking for ways to speed up their regulatory, but also with the understanding of real world evidence is what's key now.
Right.
And
so your technology can be used to develop the real world evidence that a different company may want to have for a number of different treatments.
Totally.
And patients they may be treating, right?
Yep.
Not just rhythm technology or blood pressure technology, but because of all of the biomarkers, it could be applicable to a broad set of companies.
Yeah, think about oncology, right? Cancer treatments affect the heart and the lungs from a safety standpoint.
Right.
Can we understand that? The GLP-1s, right? I mean, they are the new fat. Everybody's on them, and it's fantastic what they're doing from a weight loss and obesity declination standpoint. But is there long-term safety data on it? There isn't. I'm sure it's safe. I hope it is, but they need to figure that out, right? So post-market
and you're starting to see in some cases it's not safe, right? Particularly with cancer patients where there's some challenges associated with it. So.
And for, differences with women losing lean muscle versus men, there are issues that need to be sorted out with this. And
so it's both diagnostic and monitoring technology that can be used, frankly, in multiple settings at the end of the day, right? It's not limited to selling it to a medtech company that's doing a clinical trial. Eventually, I would suspect it would be available for those companies, but also direct to consumer in some form, in theory, right?
We would hope so. And if you think about it, there's kind of a bonus of us in a two-phase commercial strategy, right? If you're in clinical research, you're collecting real-world evidence on the sickest of sick patients, right? That is the evidence that CMS needs to see, right? Start there. Start at the bottom where the patients that are need to have on these solutions, collect the evidence there. But ultimately, once you do that, you should be able to start pushing up into the primary care space and maybe the healthy well that doesn't even want to get to that stage.
Right.
If you start with a product that's in wellness, is it are you really going to get to the sickest of sick patients? I don't know. Maybe you can.
Right.
But we made a sort of decision, and we'll see if we were correct on it. Start with the sickest of sick. Prove that you can reduce costs but improve outcomes all at the same time. And then start to go upstream for those that want to stay on top of their health, that hopefully never get to that one-way regressive path that patients with sick hearts and sick lungs have.
Well, what advice would you give others that are going through this process, through the FDA process, got approval, and now looking at the payment process? What advice would you give them as you're trying to navigate it yourself?
Payment, we're still working on.
Yeah.
I wish I had a great answer there, but obviously...
Let me ask it this way. Yeah. You talked about FDA's approach and being proactive and reaching out to you and trying to be a partner. Your theory of early and often connecting with them. Have you yet experienced the same thing with CMS or with public payers?
Good question.
In a way that early and often would be good advice, or do they need to be more proactive?
Not on the public side.
Yeah.
I do think there needs to be more of a two-way handshake there with the cultural sort of initiative of let's learn.
Yeah.
Both sides. Let's learn.
Right.
Hopefully it gets there, right? At AdvaMed, we've established a digital health board, as you're well familiar with, and we're trying to get in front of the Hill often, as well as CMS on that. I think what I've learned in my discussion with public payers, and you can even correlate this to discussion with private payers, who you can get in front of more frequently. Yeah. Private payers or the integrated distribution networks, the IDNs that have both a payer and provider arm. What I think we learned, or at least I personally learned from Gen 1 and Gen 2 digital health companies, the reason they struggled with payment, I think, was as much on who they validated on. If you get a clearance on just healthy patients, as we talked about, it's going to be tough to mandate reimbursement. But I think the larger aspect, Scott, was a lot of the digital health companies weren't replacing something.
Right.
And if you're not replacing something, you're just an add-on.
Mm-hmm.
And that becomes difficult as our system continues to, or our healthcare costs continue to increase every year, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't be covered, but if you think about it from a budget standpoint, do I keep just covering new technologies when the old ones still need to be used? I'll give a good example. We talked about arrhythmia, right? The Apple Watch ECG feature or the Fitbit ECG feature, it's great. It's awesome. It's putting power into the hand of a consumer, but it's not a medical device. If it flags something, you have to get an iRhythm patch. That you just have to do that, right? Not only is CMS and FDA requiring it, but the cardiologist is going to require it to make a decision. So can you really get paid for, the self-administered tool at home when you have to get the good next-gen tool that already exists? And so I think now, at least with our product, we are able to not just say decentralization and outcomes and value-based medicine, right? Great buzzwords and what we should be going to. But if you can't save margin up front and you can't suck direct replacement costs up front, just like in any business, this is going to be hard for adoption. And I think my approach and Nanoware's approach to the public payers is going to be around that. Where are the case studies we can show, not only from our evidence, but this cardiovascular diagnostic or this diabetes diagnostic? Dexcom's a great example, or the Abbott Libre product. They've got such good real world evidence now to show, and Dexcom recently got new reimbursement, right? To show this is what our technology has done for people that are paying out of pocket for it. Right. And now we're talking about a health equity and access thing. Because the people that are paying out of pocket are the ones that can afford to. Where is diabetes and cardiovascular disease the most rampant? It's in our economically vulnerable patients.
I've said this before, Venk. If you don't cover, you're not going to address health equity.
100%.
And that's why we fought so hard for coverage changes, right? In many ways, public payers need to take some risk to assume better outcomes and some financial risk to assume better outcomes. Not every new technology is additive either, right? In many cases, the iRhythm technology would be a good example. It may not fully replace, but it does replace.
Yes.
in a lot of cases, right?
Absolutely.
That could be the case for you. It could be the case for many. And public payers need to understand the value of early access through coverage.
Yeah.
And if they don't, and they rely only on budgetary policy, it's not the high income people who are going to be hurt by this. It's the low income people and the minority communities going to be hurt by this.
Totally.
So if you don't address coverage and payment, you're not going to address health equity.
I couldn't agree more. And I think this is where digital can be a real game changer in that, because irrespective of the socioeconomic spectrum, we're all connected now.
Yeah.
Everybody's got a smartphone. Everybody's, has some element of digital literacy.
Right.
COVID did that even for our elderly patients, right? I think where digital and where payment can really have to come together is on showing these case studies.
Yeah.
And I think that's our job at AdvaMed.
I think it is. I think it's our job at AdvaMed, but back to your original point, right? If your partner doesn't have the same approach, you're not going to be successful.
And I think that's where we got to start.
And that's the partners need to accept that they're our partners too, not just our payers.
Yeah.
Right. And when you get to that point, I would suspect it would change the culture in a way that every company like you could really benefit from.
I totally agree. And if I think a way we can do that is with the startup community as well.
Yeah.
In my experience, when I first started coming to Capitol Hill Flyings and going to CMS, I remember those days and sitting next to some of the large cap CEOs thinking I'd never get to their chairs. But I remember thinking up front, irrespective of who you were talking to, Democrat, Republican, or CMS employee or manager, they wanted to hear from the startup companies.
Yeah.
Those of us that could demo something on an app.
Right.
Not that the big companies aren't doing phenomenal technology.
Yeah.
We've extended life in so many different end stage diseases due to those big companies. But I understand why a CMS would be like, what are you asking me for more money for?
Right.
$100 billion company X, $100 billion company Y. They can't say that to 20-person Nanoware, that actually can show something very cool. So maybe that can be a way to start changing the culture a little bit. Let's get some more startups in. I've been pounding the table for more startups to be showing up to the Capitol Hill Fly-ins and to our policy engagement, because it is a different cultural element.
It is. You need to have everybody here.
Yep.
But you can't avoid having small companies here because that's where the innovation is, right?
Totally.
Even the large companies will tell you that's where the innovation is. And it's why they care so much about you being successful.
Right.
Right. And the story that you tell together is a really powerful story, I think, particularly to payers.
It's how could anybody at CMS be like, oh, this is an earnings per share discussion from Venk?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, this is about, innovators. This isn't about making money. This is, yes, we're not doing this. We're a capitalist society. We're not doing it for free, but we chose to be in here to save lives.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is why
you can make money elsewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think we need to, I'm very committed to helping shift that culture with CMS because that's paramount.
Yeah. Yeah. I want to shift the conversation to the venture community and private equity and all that's going on in financing. Just give me your sense of where we are right now and the broader finance community and the support that you're getting or the challenges you see.
I wish we were in better shape.
Yeah.
I'll approach this from two ways. We were in an era of venture capital funding that we'll likely never see again. Low interest rates, there was a ton of cash on the sidelines. The pandemic hit, and then even more sort of came in, and the push for digital technologies and at-home tools, that's what everybody wanted to fund. This is the point that, and the VC community is not going to like the answer that I'm saying here, but the VC community and investors like the flavor of the month.
Yeah.
And if something is really transformative or transformational and doesn't have a pattern recognition comp to it, like us, we were advanced material sensors no one's seen before. Putting it together in a multi-parametric device no one's seen before. Software layer, yeah, people had seen it before. Now AI and hemodynamics no one had seen before. Are we a device? Or are we hardware? Or are we software?
Right.
Are we AI? It's not their fault that investors have to look at companies in buckets that way,
Right.
but that's just the way they do it.
Right.
And it was always my thesis is we have to be all of those things to be transformative. And so whether capital was flowing or whether it's not, I think part of the issue with the venture capital community is that they unfortunately are or maybe have to be siloed in their approach on different applications. Where that I think got into a problem in the digital health in particular is that software is easy to fund. We can scale it fast. There isn't supply chain issues. There isn't, this aspect of quality control. You can bring people on quickly. And so a lot of companies that were just digital only were funded really heavy. Really high valuations too. Probably hadn't gotten a product market fit, and certainly hadn't figured out how to get paid yet. And a lot of VCs are sitting with a lot of portfolio companies of that are very overvalued. Now there's a push to show, can we get to profitability? And none of these companies were built to be profitable. They were built to grow top line. And if you have to spend $5 to spend for every $1 revenue, you and I could tell each other right now, that's not going to last unless there's an endless spigot of VC money coming in. That's gone. And it's not surprising that even when strategic or large caps or the private equity market, later stage private equity, starting to see a little bit of a pickup in 24 compared to the last year, which was a very tough funding environment, you're still seeing the VC community not in good shape. The PitchBook analysis for Q1 of 24, it was the worst VC output quarter since 2016, since Q1 2016. So it's not picking up yet. And I think it has to do with a big portfolio of companies that they need to triage first. But now they're looking for bargains, right? And so, we'd probably, companies like us that have kind of reached a stage where it's commercial growth risk, they're probably not giving you the value that they would have 2 or 3 years ago, maybe not even half the value, right? So I think the corporate venture capital community has actually picked up the slack here. There are new players in the space that are really coming into healthcare. NVIDIA is a great example. Agnostic technology players that want to sort of help in healthcare. But even our AdvaMed members are really opening up in the sense that, we've got a little bit of a path onto interest rate reduction. We've got some cash. The innovation really slowed for companies like that. And there are companies now that have kind of filtered their way to the top. It's not as difficult for them to find or at least assess who the winner might be. Before you were just like, are you doing 10 million in revenue or 15 million in revenue? Now you can kind of get down to, what does your IP and patents look like? What does your moats look like? What does your data, look like? What are your AI capabilities? Are you at home? These were questions that weren't being asked 2-3 years ago when the funding environment was immensely good for founders. And so I think the VC community will pick up. I hope, as we talked about, I hope they learn their lessons, that past era isn't coming back, and that they need to shift their criteria and not be as rigid in the rules of the types of assets. You have to be this, you have to have this metric, you have to have this metric. But I do think the validation from customers, the goalposts are pushed for us, right? We've got to show customer traction. We've got to show strategic partnerships. And we've got to show a very good understanding of where the market could go in 5 years. But I think the companies that start to lay that framework, we're going to be a good example for the next ones. I do worry that the AI craze, not just in healthcare, but just broadly, is already kind of a little bit of a bubble. And I suspect 90-95% of these companies will shake out and not really turn into anything, and the winners will surface. So.
One of the things we try to do every year at the Medtech conference is to create the opportunities for investors to come, small companies to come, large companies to come as well. And part of that process is to collaborate with each other, get together with the business development folks, the folks who do have money and want to fund startups. What's your experience been like at the Medtech conference, and why should others come to that?
The Medtech conference is the reason I started joining AdvaMed back in 2016. The first conference I came to was in Minneapolis in 2016. And I just thought the ecosystem of what we have from a people standpoint. People think of AdvaMed, we think of us as a policy wonk shop that all we're doing is just, in the the halls of CMS and FDA and on Capitol Hill, but there's a community involved here of CEOs and leaders from tiny under 10 person companies when I joined to the 50,000 person companies, but yet everybody's a peer. And what I think was very cool about our association is we recognized, as we are all peers as founders and CEOs, now we have to bring in the investor community as well, as to be a part of that community. Yeah. Because they're integrally involved to everyone's success. And, our investment working group now is however many participants. I think we're over 30 or 40 already. Yeah. More are joining the fold. And I think everybody hearing these discussions, at board meetings, we're talking about a lot of the things we're talking about now. Now the investors are hearing the same thing, right? Investors are hearing and trying to make a thesis around where is AI going? Where is digital going? Just as the way the industry operators are. And I think the Medtech conference in particular, if you look at just our last year and 2 years before, the matchmaking forums, particularly for the startup companies, we heard such good feedback from Anaheim last year and Boston the year before. Can't wait for Toronto this year.
That's great. So it's in Toronto early in October, and so we're excited about that. It's the first time we've gone outside the 48 or 50 states, but we're looking forward to it.
So we're going to go to Hawaii next?
Nah, maybe 2 years from now. So anyway, let's close with a little fun lightning round. I've done this with others, but just give me a quick reaction to these questions. Your favorite or most influential book you've read recently?
The 7 Moons. It's a book that my mom recommended to me. There's some Hindu spiritual culture in it, but it's really about moving towards a goal and understanding that things you're going to have to be appreciative and lucky about, but also creating your own luck from your persistence and being grounded in what's right and what's wrong and approaching it from that every day. I typically read books that are narrative-based nonfiction and that really telling a story about somebody or some group of people. That's the one I read recently.
Yeah, we'll have to add that to our bookshelf behind your right shoulder.
No, I'll bring it I'll bring it in June. I still read hard copies. I can't read on a screen anymore.
Yeah, I do a little bit of both, but screens are nice. Yeah. So, favorite president, U.S. president?
That's an easy one for me, Barack Obama. For those of us that were in college or I was in grad school at the time when he kind of burst onto the scene, I was 25, 26 years old. It was really tough to not have almost a romantic relationship with him. I mean, he was young. He was so charismatic. He just, beyond the obvious, it was just something so different to his approach. And the timing, I think he's the first to admit he was fortuitous with the timing, with the digital age, with social media, just how he got so many of us involved in politics. Which we never were before, right? I had a really good friend from college that was very, very high up on his staff as well. So I heard a lot of the stories and just felt like a very humanized type leader behind the scenes as well as in front of the scenes. Didn't agree with everything that he did, but just a president that I think was so transformational for the time, and took us out of that recession as well in a really strong way.
Yeah. If you could have dinner with one person, dead or alive, would it be Obama or is it someone else?
It would not be Obama.
Yeah.
I'd love to have dinner with him and a glass of wine. Don't get me wrong. But it was interesting at the CEO summit when we were listening to the panel with Dave Axelrod and Karl Rove, and just the times that we're in right now. I'd have to say I'd want to have dinner with Lincoln.
Yeah.
I mean, think about the times that he navigated, right? And I was encouraged when Mr. Rove said, we've been through some pretty dark times before.
Yeah, that's right.
So as scary as this is for me and for a lot of people, that we are just so at each other's throats across the aisle, when most of us feel like I think we're right in the middle.
Yeah.
And it probably was similar back then.
Yeah.
And in worse shape.
Yeah. Stakes were a little higher.
Yeah.
Right. Back then than they are today. For sure. So you reflect on your career so far, the last question. Biggest success, biggest failure, and what'd you learn from them?
That's a good question. Maybe I'll start with the success first. It was the first and only feature film I produced with my twin brother. It was a film very ambitious, shoestring budget. We wanted to shoot New York and Los Angeles. It was loosely based on my twin brother moving from New York to LA with his friends trying to break into the industry. Right. Kind of like the opposite of the show Entourage. They don't make it. Right. But we shot the film. And as I mentioned, as a medtech startup, filmmaking is very much like a medtech startup. 12 months before you're sort of finalizing the screenplay, then you're sort of at the same time getting locations, you're getting talent, you're getting what have you. All those trains need to move to, meet at that 2 to 3 weeks of production when you're shooting. We get to day 2 and our lead actor walks off set. And I think 99.9% of filmmakers would have said, we're done, guys. Thanks for coming. Fly everybody home.
Right.
We just cared about this story so much that we sat down. We talked to another one of our leads. I was like, can we elevate you here? You know the script pretty well. We just came up with so many on the fly decisions, my twin and I, and we finished the film and it theatrically released 3 years later in New York, Philly, and LA. Great film, almost too ahead of its time. But I think that shaped me. And, there are going to be many, many times where you want to give up, as an entrepreneur. And there's always you may not see it, but there's an answer to keep the lights on and to keep going. And sometimes it's unavoidable, but that was a great success for us. And the failure is interesting. I'd say the biggest failure I had, which actually kind of led me into business school, was in the pharma industry when, if you remember in 2006, the rules changed on HIPAA laws and entertainment and all of that. And I had gotten so used to the original rules. And I was like, how do they expect me to build a relationship with the insurance primes and with these physicians and stuff? I'm not doing anything out of bounds or anything like that. I mean, we're building a relationship over dinner, right? And now I can't do that anymore. And my next 2 quarters, my numbers were terrible. And I was like, gosh, I'm a failure. I'm not going to be able to figure this out. I better go to business school and learn some new tricks. So I think failing from that kind of pushed me into business school. Would probably never ended up in finance, never met the entrepreneurs that we worked with, and then maybe never started the company with my dad.
You don't fail, you don't learn, right?
That's
and so sounds like it was true for you as well. Yeah. So I was going to ask, you're too young to have many failures at this stage of your career, but sounds like at least one, so that's good.
Well, I think you fail on a daily basis. I don't like calling it failure. I like calling it learning. Yeah. I could probably list 100 failures that happened at Nanoware that we learned from and made us better. Yeah.
That's the process. So good. Yeah. Great to have you on the show.
Thanks, Scott. All right. Appreciate it.
Thanks again for tuning in to the Medtech POV podcast. For more episodes, visit advamed.org/podcast or subscribe to Medtech POV on your favorite streaming platform.